I don't know, you have to be mindful, and you have to take risks, though. And that's what, and I think you're more of a risk taker than Milton. And he's becoming more of a risk taker than I had anticipated that he would be. But
without risk, there could be no reward.
Well, that's true. That is absolutely true.
Big it up, big it up. Yep.
Welcome to Let's Talk Real, and I wanted to introduce my mom, Dr. Sandra Yates. Without my mom and my dad, obviously there would be no Melvin Yates, there would be no Exit Flagship Realty or any other real estate related anything. So, welcome, Mom.
Thank you, thank you.
All right, and I'm gonna jump right into it. When Milton and I were younger, when did you first know that that we were going to be entrepreneurs?
Probably somewhere during junior high school. I like to think that you and Milton were always, well, you're 6 years apart for one thing, but you kind of head started this, and you all began to engage in activities in the neighborhood, you know, selling and buying and trying to figure out how to make money. And that was always at the top of your to-do list, I suppose. And I guess that's where you are now, still trying to figure out how to make more money.
And help people. We, serve in real estate.
Right.
You know, we help a lot of families. Mm-hmm. So, and we didn't get this, obviously we didn't make this up on our own. You and Dad were.
No, when we first got married in 1971, before we married in October, but the summer before we decided to buy a piece of property.
I didn't know that. That happened before. I didn't know that.
So you don't know a lot of things. We decided to buy a piece of property so that when we got married, we moved into, or just before we got married, we moved into our home in Prince George's County. Okay. And that was the first investment that we made. And after we stayed there a few years, we decided that we needed to move on up. So we bought a piece of property. We sold the one we were in and bought a piece of property on the next street over. And at that point, we began to say, maybe we should keep, if we buy something else, perhaps we should keep the property that we already own. But of course, that requires money and a certain kind of investment that we weren't sure whether we were ready for that. And then the location, we both lived in D.C. before we got married. But then when we moved to Maryland, we said we weren't going past a certain street. We weren't going past...
Too far.
Right.
Dad wanted to stay in D.C.,
He wanted to stay in D.C.
You didn't want to be in D.C.,
right.
I remember that. And this is the 70s, mid-70s.
Yeah, 71 was when we got married.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you came along in 73, and then Milton came along in 79. So it's... and there were things that you and Milton did, growing up. Mowing lawns, and I remember clearly in one instance, there was a man a family that you used to mow their lawn, and the man died. And you came home and you were very upset because he had passed and you hadn't been paid.
I don't remember that story. We'll have to edit this part out. I don't. But yes, no.
And he went to the lady's house. You went to her house and you said, I just, Mr. And she explained that her husband had passed. And you didn't know, and you came home and told us, and you wanted to know how to go back.
What was the process?
Yeah, to get your money for that service.
The services rendered.
And our position was that in an instance like this, perhaps you would pass on that money, but you had that entrepreneurial spirit, and you did a service, and you should be paid for the service. And I think ultimately she did pay for that. But I mean, it's those little things that I remember over the years that you encountered, and you would come back, and at least you did ask us for our opinion on matters of this type.
Did that mean I always took the advice?
No, you tried though. You tried, and I think in later years, because you were different in age, difference in age between you and Milton, it wasn't until later that Milton saw what we were doing, and we were actually trying to, not deliberately, but almost building an empire, because we would buy a property and we had a good real estate agent. I have to give Beverly Farrell. Yeah, she would see a property and she says, I see a property on Hawthorne Street and it's a good buy and perhaps you should consider. In fact, in Landover, we sold a property in order to buy another one because she thought it was a better investment. And in hindsight, I said, maybe we should have kept that one also. and that would have continued to help build the wealth. And I think when Melvin and you and Milton saw us do these things, I think you learned a lot from that. And I always say that years ago I learned about entrepreneurship. And because I taught business courses for so long, one of the courses I taught was Introduction to Business. And we always went through this session on entrepreneurship and what is an entrepreneur. And an entrepreneur is a risk taker. Now, I learned that from you and Milton, and particularly you, because in order to be an entrepreneur, you must be a risk taker. And I wasn't, and my husband, your dad, was not as much of a risk taker as you were. And that troubled us a little bit. But we saw how successful you were being a risk taker, and I assume you're still a risk taker.
Calculated risk.
Calculated
Right.
risk.
So you know, you and Dad. I'm gonna jump back. How did you guys meet?
Oh boy, we worked in a district government agency on what is that street? South Dakota and what's that street that crosses South Dakota Avenue and near Rhode
New York
Island?
Avenue? Oh,
No, out that way, going far northeast. And there were government agencies that rented space in those buildings. And I was driving at the time, and he took the bus. And occasionally, anybody who got off the bus had to walk up this steep hill. And I'd stopped every now and then to pick him up to see if he wanted to ride up the hill. Of course, he did want to ride up the
so
hill.
Dad was hitchhiking.
He was hitchhiking,
Okay.
yes. And that's how we met. And somehow we started dating from that point. And it, ended up in a marriage for so many years and 2 boys.
Well, that's a lesson, I guess. If you're better than the dating app, you could just pick up hitchhikers and maybe find your future spouse.
Yeah, that worked back then. And we laughed about that for years, because that's how we actually met. Because he worked for a different government agency in the same space up that hill.
And so then we fast forward. So purchased an investment property prior to the wedding.
Right,
Then,
and it was just we said we want to live in a house, and it was a small semi-detached place, and it worked. And then we decided that maybe it was time for us to move into a larger space, and that's when we found a place for sale about a block away from where we were currently living. But we sold the house that we originally were in.
And then use the money for that, put
go
down
into-
on the new
right.
house, and then ultimately use the money from that to move into a little further south in Prince George's County.
And then at some point, I don't remember the first year that we bought an investment property, but we realized that you needed some money to do that, and that once you get started, and you had to learn about tenancy and what it means to have a tenant and how to work with tenants. And there were lots of lessons that we learned by dealing with. We had good tenants, bad tenants. We still have good tenants and bad tenants. Primarily more good tenants than bad tenants. But there are lessons to be learned from that, though.
Yeah, and then also patience, vicissitudes, overcoming vicissitudes.
And when I would teach, especially in all my business classes, somehow I would bring into the picture some of the experiences that I had. And then, of course, if there was something I didn't know the answer to, I would tell my students that that was something that I missed because I was skipped from the 1st to the 3rd grade. And so I must have missed that from not going to the 2nd grade.
They taught that in the 2nd grade?
Yeah, they taught it in the 2nd grade. So I went from the 1st grade to the 3rd grade. And I enjoyed that.
All right. And how has, real estate and investing, how has that, well, before I get to that, so what was ultimately you were a government agent and then, worked for a government agency, you and Dad, you got married, then you had a career as an educator.
Right,
Both of you
right,
had
right.
careers
Both
in
of us.
education. What was your career and how did real estate kind of help supplement the income from real estate?
Well, we realized in working with a real estate agent, and we worked with the same agent all the time, and when she would see how you could do a special deal, she would call us and say, hey, I know you have another property here. You don't need to spend but X number of dollars, but you can get X number of dollars in rent. And that sounded good. And I said, okay, well, that will help pay tuition. And, you all were in, at that time, you were in Sheridan or one of the other private schools. And, of course, we needed money for that. And so we had to make sure that we had the adequate funds. And I give a lot of credit to Beverly Farrell and her husband who worked with us and shared with us how you can make something happen. And at first I was a little hesitant, but then, Melvin, your dad, said, let's go for it. And once we did the
That was
first
good.
investment, oh
Let's
my
go for
goodness,
it.
it just,
Right.
it went from one property to another. And, people got
another,
to
to
ask
another,
us,
to another.
you're not buying another place, aren't you? Are you? And I said, well, we're going to try this. And so far, but you have to be, I don't know, you have to be mindful and you have to take risks though. And and I think you're more of a risk taker than Milton. And he's becoming more of a risk taker than I had anticipated that he would be. But
Without risk, there could be no reward.
well, that's true. That is absolutely true. And a lot of people still will not take that risk. And I mean, I learned also when two partners and I owned a daycare center in D.C. And that was really taking a risk. But I would always tell my students in class that just to show you that I was really not as much of a risk taker as other people were. She worked at Howard University, the other one worked in DC Public Schools, and I worked at UDC, which was Federal City at the time. And neither one of us would quit our job. But a real risk taker, one of us should have quit our jobs.
Full-time.
But we wanted to, we were afraid to do that. And I always would tell people that the reason we weren't risk takers then. And we had a successful child care center for probably 8 or 10 years, and then eventually.
That would have been in the 80s during that time. Right?
And then we ended up, selling it, and got out of that business. But it was good. It was a good business. I learned a lot. We all learned a lot in that business.
Yeah, you had a few. You guys had what, two locations, 3 locations?
Right. We ended up with because what would happen is that you couldn't have it, depending upon the space, you couldn't have it so many children in your facility. So, when the inspector came out and said, I see you have X number of kids, you're going to have to find another space. And just that alone was taking a risk because we could have said we're going to stop at that point. But the need for childcare was so great and still is great. So we ended up opening another site. And so at one point we had 3 sites, and that was challenging because someone—
And 3 sets of staff.
Yeah, and if a child, a couple of them were close to one another, so if you didn't pick your child up at 6 o'clock, by 6:30, and we couldn't reach the parent, we would bring one child up the street to the other facility, and that helped a lot. That didn't happen that often, but those are what we call vicissitudes. Now, that was a vicissitude. And even one of the greatest challenges for us was when we had to, we couldn't contact the parent, and we had to take the child someplace. And I remember taking one of the kids to South Capitol Street. There was a McDonald's on the corner, but that was years ago, and they tore that McDonald's down. And I took the child there first to give her some supper, and then I had to take her to one of the child care DC government places where they would make sure that the child was put back to her parent. But again, those are things that entrepreneurs have to learn how to do and have to accept. And, taking a risk. I could have had an accident. Anything could have happened. But we were just so careful in areas like that.
Yeah, and that was, so then the daycare, so you're out of the daycare and then fully just basically University District of Columbia and a career as a professor, administrator, ultimately.
Yeah, and my students ask me, why don't you go into real estate? Why don't you do it? And I said, well, we're doing fine just buying property and renting it out and just.
So you never got a real estate license? You weren't?
No, I didn't.
You guys were only on the investment side?
We were just only on the investment.
And trusting in your realtor. At the time.
And that requires, you have to trust in your realtor, and you have to hope that they know what they're talking about. So that's why I try to make sure I know what you're talking about before I make a decision.
So before you so you don't get bamboozled.
Right.
All right, and so you end up with these, over time, you don't end up with them, but you guys are working hard, taking your paycheck salary, putting down payments on houses, using the rent proceeds to then buy more property and end up with this, what amounted to a portfolio of real estate. And I will say this, that I didn't, coming up, as a teenager, I was so busy doing these other things, between the landscape business to the vending businesses and just different things.
Moving.
Yeah, the moving and storage company, that I, at the time, even before college, didn't really stop to pay attention that while a lot of my friends were in the A building, as we call it, Howard, the A building, where everyone stood in line and tried to get their financial aid together, that I never didn't have to do that. I had a teeny little piece of wrestling scholarship, and the rest was covered.
Right.
And at the time, and then had to really sit back and reflect and say, you know what, real estate. You and Dad, but you guys did it because of real estate. You were able. Real estate afforded you guys the ability to be able to pay my tuition.
Absolutely.
In a payment, where a lot of my friends had loans, still have loans, unless they got forgiven recently.
Right. How about that?
Loans. So I want to thank you. That was, and that's when I guess in college, I was in college and probably near the end of college when I realized, wow, I'm very blessed in that sense to not have to worry about that as a burden.
Right. And then the wrestling scholarships helped, both you and Milton, at Howard, and that helped also. But and you never know what your children. Both of you majored in business. That's the other thing, and I think that Howard probably did a great job in preparing you for the real world. And plus, you could use your dad and me as examples of what you can do if you're capable of maintaining a certain business style and managing your affairs well. And those are things that you and Milton both probably learned from us. And you remind me of that periodically.
Once in a while. So, and I want to ask, when I was 16, I remember with the car, I wanted to get my license right away. You guys came home and said, Melvin, we brought you a car.
Right.
And I said, oh, thank you.
It was a little Ford truck.
Yeah. And we said, no, we didn't bought you a car. We brought you a car. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And you had a contract?
Oh, yeah. And I have in my files now, I have copies of all the contracts that both you and Milton engaged in us with. And even since your dad died, there have been some contracts. And when you paid it off, because the truck was, I forget how much it was.
It was $7,000.
It was $7,000, okay. And you paid a little, and I don't even know where you got the money from to pay, but you had to pay it off. I mean, we allowed you to drive it and do whatever, and we had to pay the insurance. But you managed, and therefore the next time around, after that was paid off, then something else came up and you needed a few dollars.
A stipend.
And so we were able to do that. And we had to trust that you would take advantage, take care of your expenses.
Well, that was, and that would have been 1989, right around my birthday. And I remember, right, another summer, right? And I remember that, get in the truck, being excited for the truck, and we're like, well, what's this? And you had the receipt. It was $7,000. I don't think you charged me the tax.
Right.
And you guys took care of the tags and registration. But we left, on that day, when you came home with the vehicle, we went straight to the bank, and I had to give up, $3,000, I think I put $3,000 down, and you financed it over 12 months.
Right.
So I paid like $333 a month for 12 months. And at the time, I was like, well, I didn't really think about it. I was like, well, okay, well, I guess that's how it's supposed to work. And my friends didn't have cars. So I thought, I was like, yeah. And then my friends said, oh, you got a car for your birthday? I was like, no, I bought this car.
I bought this car.
Yeah, no, I financed it partially, but I had to pay for it. That was my birthday present. I got the ability to earn credit. So that's when I first learned about credit, and sometimes credit, goes up and down. You have good credit, and sometimes I've been in situations where my credit was not good.
Right. And I remember your being on Howard's campus with the little, was it an ice cream cart or some kind of cart?
Yeah, we had that. We had a hot dog cart.
Hot dog cart. You were selling things out there on the ground. And I'm trying to figure out how you're going to be in class and have this little cart going at the same time. But you somehow managed, And, getting up early in the morning and getting folks who were working for you at one point. You were real...
wrestling practice started at 6 a.m.
Right.
At Howard. So I had to get up, lived in one of the... another thing, being able to live in one of the rental properties.
Right, now that
and pay less than market rent.
Yeah.
I tell people I paid half the rent, half the time.
Right.
When I right.
Yeah, that was challenging, but at the time we had 2 properties in Landover, and we still do. And you stayed in one, and Milton stayed in the other, and you paid. And then what was interesting, though, the most interesting part of your living in Virginia Avenue was you had a classmate who was a student at Howard who needed a place to stay, so you subleased the bedroom to her. And what you did, I think you gave up your master bedroom so that she would feel comfortable paying the rent that she had to pay.
Right.
And then, we had to ask
Which
her, well,
was market, right?
Yeah, but what part of that do we get? So as long as you get your rent that you charge,
Right, so I was,
and then you sublease. And then I said, oh my goodness, that's the entrepreneur spirit kicking in big time. But that was different. That was definitely different.
yeah, those were you definitely you and Dad definitely taught Milton and I lessons about life and business and particularly with real estate and incorporating it in. So I want to kind of fast forward to I'll say a topic. Recently it was announced a few months back that Charles County surpassed for decades Prince George's County has been the most affluent county in the country for African Americans, and a few months back it was announced that that Charles County is now the new number 1. Prince George's is number 2, and we know that before people were moving further out, out, and now folks are selling their houses in D.C. and even in Prince George's or selling them in D.C. and skipping over Prince George's to go to Charles County to get more for their money. So the county executive announced they've seen huge gains in property tax income and income tax income going into the coffers of Charles County. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd like to see it come back where Prince George's County would have that rating. But it's understandable because over the years, people's lifestyles have changed. And many people, many friends have moved further out. And they still will work in D.C. And they didn't mind moving out to get what they thought was better property at a lower rate because the rates for property in D.C. seemed to have been high. And they felt like they could move on out. And I think once they started seeing places beyond Prince George's County, and after a while, you get used to it. I mean, when we didn't ever want to move past St. Barnabas Road, and we ended up where we are now, because we were on what was that other street? I forget. But we had several places.
Oxen Run Drive.
Oxen Run Drive, and so you learn and talk to other people, and you talk to real estate people who will say, well, Charles County has some good quality houses, and some people haven't heard of Charles County. Where is that? But we now know the advantage that it has been for them, and I'm happy for them. But eventually,
but it might come back. And COVID's kind of sped that up because people realized that a lot of people were able to telework and they didn't have to go into work. So if they did work in D.C., they didn't have to live in D.C.
Right.
And they said, well, I can live wherever if I'm only coming into work 1 day a week or 2 days a week.
Absolutely.
So I think that had something to do with it. So what's the I guess the most interesting, real estate story? It could be a tenant story, could be a, well, if it's a tenant story, I think maybe 46th place. But or buying a property or selling a property. I know you haven't sold many properties, but what would be an interesting story that kind of comes to mind? One that sticks out.
There are lots of tenant stories. There's some positive ones where you learn how to work closely with your tenants. I've learned a lot since the pandemic. When you have tenants who always pay their rent, and then when the pandemic came along, they got behind. And what I would do, and some people probably would think that's crazy, there was a tenant who lives in Capitol Heights, and she called and said, they've let me go. I don't have any income right now, but if you would work with me. So I said, well, pay what you can. And that for about 6 months, she paid what she could, maybe half of the rent or some of the rent, and I didn't charge her any late fees. And I use her as an example because when she did go back to work, she called me and she said, Ms. Yates, I have my job back. I'm building up my savings and doing what I need to do. And now she pays her rent 2 or 3 days before the time that it's due. And that's one of those good person stories. And I have several tenants like that. And then, of course, on the reverse side, you have those
Other
who
stories.
are trying to other stories. But I think that
And you're right. Most people would not, and that's one thing I say. You know, you and Dad have always been, have always expressed the importance of being compassionate. And I
Right,
think
right.
bringing that back to the very first story with the landscape business and
Right.
me trying to, and you were saying, listen, you should consider letting it go.
yeah, yeah. You have to, you have to let things go. We learned the hard way many times, but over a period of time, it's been to our advantage because there are ways in which so you have to write it off on your taxes if that's what you have to do. But we have, and of course, I think that I always use my leapling piece in there as a leapling and not being that old. Won't be 20 until 2024.
That's right.
There's so many lessons that I had to learn as a leapling. But I think that
What's a leapling for
a
those that
leapling
don't?
for
Right, some may not
someone who
know.
was born on February 29th, and I think all the grandchildren understand that now. It took them a while to know what that means. So I don't get a birthday, and you had to show them the calendar, and I had to do the same thing with you all. That in February there is no 29 on certain years, and folks didn't understand that, and still people don't. I mean, I can tell somebody, they're always asking for your birthday, and you tell them what it is, and they'll say, "Oh, you're one of those," whatever that means. Yeah. But I use that quite often. But I think that if you are, your focus is on talking real, there's so many lessons that I think realtors need to know and learn, and you learn it from real life experiences. And I think over the years, you and Milton have learned, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you've had lots of vicissitudes, and you've had to.
You calling me ugly? No.
You had to learn how to overcome the challenges. And being a business person has many, many challenges. I talk to you and Milton all the time about what I'm accustomed to doing. I like a certain amount of money in my bank account. I worked hard. I worked for 46 years at UDC. It was Federal City and then eventually University of the District of Columbia. And I learned a lot working there. And then working there and having a side business, the daycare center for a while, and then the daycare center ended up being into rental properties, and that has been, advantageous to our whole family. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't say that your dad's mother and father, and this is another example of someone being a risk taker. When his mom died, his stepdad lived there in the house in Martin Luther King Avenue. And then he died, and the house belonged to your dad and his siblings. So one of his siblings said, "Well, let's buy the house and pay it off." And so Melvin said, "Let's do that." And eventually, none of the siblings wanted to be involved. And so Melvin came home and said, "What do you think? You think I should buy?" And in order to buy that house, we had to go to the bank and borrow money because we needed to pay them. So we got the value of the house and divided it, I guess at that time, maybe 4 ways, and give them their amount. And then we had to have money to renovate the space.
To fix the house.
And so we've kept that house. And then one of your dad's aunts and uncles left a house for them in D.C. And again, we had to go to the bank and say, "Okay, we need money in order to fix up this house." And it was his aunt died first, and then his uncle died. And after they passed, the house immediately came to us. And some people would say, "Well, you need to just sell the house." But we didn't want to do that. We just felt like, no, let's just take that risk. So your dad was actually an entrepreneur as well. He was probably more an entrepreneur than
risk taker.
And the same thing happened when my mom died in North Carolina, the house that we grew up in, that when she died, the house was left to 3 of us, because we were the ones who were taking care of her in her later years. Although I still had living sisters and a brother who helped out occasionally. but she made it possible for the house to be put in our three names. And she was able to take her name off the deed.
And you did the same thing.
And
You
so I
bought
did,
them.
and so
you
I
your
bought the other
siblings
two out. And we, we had a record. We'd seen how that works, and it worked well. And so we still have that house. But that's, again, I never knew that I was, some days I'd be entrepreneurs and other days I wouldn't be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I want you to kind of speak to risk, but I want to have a quote, kind of the quote of the day from Mark Zuckerberg. The biggest risk is not taking any risk. In a world that is changing really quickly, the only strategy that is guaranteed to fail is not taking any risk.
Right.
So Mark Zuckerberg, so how do you, I mean,
Well,
and you mentioned risk earlier, but.
Yeah, and that's the truth. It takes a lot of thinking to decide on that risk, because risk taking, it's a lot to it. It's not as easy as you would think it would be. But I've learned over the years that in order for you to be successful in many instances is to take the risk. And in doing that, you realize that things will be all right. But it's only after you, and they're still, with taking a risk, there are challenges throughout. And I've learned so many things from taking risks. And I said, now, if I had not taken that risk, certain things would not have happened. And so, I mean, that's a nice quote from him.
And almost like in baseball, you will hit zero. You won't hit any balls if you don't take a swing.
Right.
You got to try. And with risk comes challenges, like you said. I mean, I've had many, and sometimes you fall flat on your face, but you get back up and you brush yourself off. It's how quickly you can brush yourself off and get back going. I think that's what defines a person.
And a lot of people, if I share some experiences that I've had with rental properties with other people, they say, see, that's why I don't want to own anything. I mean, right now, there's one vacant property, but for a month there were two vacant properties. And so that's income that's not covered, So I'm looking forward to that income to put in the bank.
Right, just not coming back, right.
Yeah. And so, but once you take care of those things, I mean, those are what we call those vicissitudes. And you can't avoid unless you just say, well, and every now and then I wake up and say, I should just sell everything and go over to MGM and
Right. and see if you can flip it. Give it to Mr. or Mrs. MGM.
MGM, right.
All right. Well, you shared a lot. Like I said, we are, Milton and I are super grateful, and our family is very blessed. And you and Dad really, and I guess it started with, Grandma and on your side and Grandma and Papa on Dad's side with real estate and owning and what that really meant to actually own your own and have something to pass. Legacy is big. As you know, we're always talking and we started doing our family financial meetings to really do the planning to make sure that the grandchildren's grandchildren are going to have something at some point in the future. Hopefully they would say, you know what, wow, all of this is because of great grandma.
And you all have learned that there was something called a Bank of Yates, and that you've tried to
Then we don't get loans.
get
sometimes
loans
approved, sometimes denied.
Sometimes denied. Yeah, you have to make that decision and figure it out. And it'll be interesting to see when your kids will say, "Well, I'm going to Dad or Mom or somebody and go to the Bank of Yates to see if I can get a small loan." But I mean, you have to. There are lessons to be learned from that, though. There are lessons to be learned, and there are things that you can teach your children, and ultimately your grandchildren, and tell them these stories. About what.
And it's more, and the legacy is, as I've learned and studied recently, is more than just the money piece.
Oh yeah.
Just because if you just leave the money, it gets divvied up and then sometimes squandered.
Right.
But so it's also the mindset and the education of like what you did with the contract when I was 16. Melvin didn't. I don't think he had a contract. He just wanted, half and half.
Right.
Let's pay half, someone else pay half, and then it's paid for.
Right.
Barely could get get him to pay the insurance and the title and transfer. But starting to work on that and showing, listen, this it doesn't grow on trees. You do have to earn it, and so there's still work to be done.
Right, and that's what I'm hoping. And your dad would be proud that you and Milton are doing that, or taking some of the things that he taught you. how to move forward, and you can apply those same things to your own kids, and it works out. You know, there are challenges still. You know, how much you owe me, yeah.
Well, I know. I need a real a financial calculator to
Right,
figure that out.
right.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for
Sure.
being my very first guest on Let's Talk Real. So I want to thank you. I love you, Mom.
Love you too. All right.
Big it up, big